the concept of comfort and safety are interrelated, and that we need to get to a system of connected networks if we're going to achieve safety in numbers is foundational to the whole document and the way the words are written, the guidance is produced, and it's everywhere. And so it really is why we ended up rewriting. We rewrote a lot of the text from the 2012 guide. It's a different document.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Towns channel. My name is John Zimmerman, and that is Bill Schultheiss from Toole Design Group. We're going to be talking about the newly released AASHTO Bicycle Facilities Design Guide. But before we get to that, let me just say thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. And if you are enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. It's easy to do. Just navigate over to activetowns.org, click on the support tab at the top of the page. There's several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all this video content. Well, without further ado, let's get to it with Bill Schultheiss talking about the AASHTO Bicycle Facilities Design Guide. Bill Schultheiss, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast. Welcome.
Hey, I'm really excited to be here, John. It's a real honor and a pleasure.
Bill, I love giving my guests just an opportunity to introduce themselves. So who's Bill and what's that 30-second elevator pitch as to who you are?
Let's see. Well, I started my career saying I'm a reformed wastewater engineer. I came out of engineering school in 1998 in Boston from Northeastern University. And then I came into the transportation field in 2003 when I started work at Toole Design. So I've been practicing for 23 years at Toole Design in the transportation design space.
Fantastic. And I'll pull up the Toole Design website right now and we can see that. Talk a little bit about Toole Design. What's the history of the organization? You've obviously been there for a while now.
So this week is actually our 23rd anniversary. Yeah, it's pretty great. It's kind of hard to believe. It's been that long. 22, sorry, misspeak. It was 2003 when we formed. It's 2025. So keeping up. I can't believe how fast time has gone by. When I joined in 2003, Jennifer had purchased this little office in Laurel, Maryland from a company called Sprinkle Consulting that was based out of Florida. She was their first satellite office.
Okay.
They had invented bicycle level of service, which is this really groundbreaking strategy back in the 90s. But Jennifer decided to break out on her own in 2003 and start Toole Design. So there were 5 of us 22 years ago, and now we are 300 strong.
Wow, fantastic. And for those in the international audience as well, and as well as in the domestic audience, what does the space that Toole Design really occupy? And what's sort of your niche and what are you guys out there doing in terms of helping transform the built environment?
Yeah, Jennifer founded us as a firm that aspired to build what we planned. She's a landscape architect. So we started by hiring all the disciplines, so engineering, planning, landscape architecture, and we've grown all 3. So we really are a 50-50 mix of planning, analysis, studies, and delivery, building the products that we've been studying and recommending. So we are solely in the transportation space. Lots of urban reconstructions, transformations of urban streets, but we work in suburban locations and some rural locations as well. But again, we stay in the transportation realm, but we're full service in that space.
Right. Now, you're primarily here to chat with me today about the new AASHTO bike guide, and I see right here on the website there's a little blurb about this. It looks like it was a blog post from December to sort of introduce this concept. Why don't you give a little background as to this particular guide? What's sort of its origins, and why the heck did it need to be revised?
Well, we're really excited. It's actually been a 10-year process to get this update published. So when it came out just before the Christmas holidays, we felt like it was a Christmas present to the transportation industry. And so AASHTO is very excited about it. We're very excited about it, very proud of the work. And so that's what you're seeing is that blog post was published the day of the announcement. But, all transportation design guidance is updated. The schedule varies, but we understand that things evolve and the industry's trying to stay with best practices. So some documents are updated every year, maybe with a city, and some are more every 5 years or 10 years. That schedule varies, but this guide was last printed in 2012, and a lot changed in the bike design world, from 2012 to today. And so there was a real need for this update to happen.
One of the things that I remember about the 2012 edition is because I've been running the Active Towns initiative, since basically 2011, when I founded my nonprofit Advocates for Healthy Communities and hit the road sort of exploring what cities were doing to become more walkable, bikeable places and encouraging active living and active mobility. My sense was that it was kind of already outdated when it was produced. And that kind of is reflected. I've got the monster right here. This thing is just a beast. I don't even know how many pages it is because it's not labeled with the number of pages, but it's a monster. But it really does seem like it needed to be updated, and some of the language in the very first pages of this document, this guide, indicate that, we were kind of in the dark ages and we needed to bring it around to represent current best practices from a global perspective.
For sure. I think what's fascinating about that is in 2012, that was a big deal update.
Yeah.
The prior editions were like 75 pages in length.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, well, now this 2012 guide is now 200 pages, so like doubled in size, went from 3 chapters to 7. And now we've once again dramatically expanded what's in there. And I think what that shows, what it says actually, is how much the industry changed from like the 1990 to now. And actually, I feel fortunate to have been working in this field at this time, because when I started work at Toole in 2003, I would go to meetings and it was a fight to put in a normal striped bike lane. And then the shared lane marking came out. Oh, that's going to change the world. But it was really just this Band-Aid of when we weren't willing to make a real change to a street. But that was a big deal. So it's hard to believe that in 2003, that was the environment we were living in. Just narrowing a lane from 12 feet to 11 was this earth-shattering decision. So that you could then add a door-zone bike lane to a street. And that's really where the industry was at in 2003. And now, 22 years later, that's seen as not a good design, and that if we're not doing full separation and separated bike lanes, we're really not delivering what the public wants. And I think that's incredible. That's an incredible change that happened in a very short time. Now it's in a standpoint of how an industry views time. I think for each advocate, each year is an eternity. But in the scheme of an industry changing, that's a huge, fast pace of change, really quick.
Yeah. And you mentioned the size, and it is kind of interesting to compare, side by side the Dutch Crow manual and then this thing. They really put it into a small little package, but it seems as if they and their systems, and the Crow has many other manuals, just like AASHTO has many other manuals, and we'll get into talking a little bit about these guides and these manuals in just a bit. But yeah, I mean, for the Dutch, this is like second nature. They've been doing this they're a good 50 years ahead of us in terms of really fine-tuning what the bikeways are about and how to go about doing them. We are in the reality that, we've been sort of stuck in a completely different world. We've been stuck in a world where, this has been our reality. We've been a car-dependent culture by design. And when I had Wes Marshall on after he recently published his book Killed by a Traffic Engineer, we talked a lot about just how these design guides and these manuals, the historical context of them and what brought them about. And he was just baffled by the lack of scientific evidence and, how a lot of these things came up and how some of these guides end up becoming the bane of our existence, like the MUTCD that says, oh, no, you can't do that, or you can do it, but you have to, quote unquote, exercise that engineering judgment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they tend to be cop-outs for not doing what we need to do to create more streets for people and safer, more welcoming environments and creating places that aren't, what we're looking at here, which is, the car dependent culture by design.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's something that the average person doesn't think about. And I got to say, as a former wastewater engineer, I didn't think about it. I had one transportation engineering class in college, in my civil engineering program, because I was focused on the environmental side. But the advantage it gave me was I wasn't, and I didn't come through a traditional engineering firm where I was kind of given passed down training.
Right.
So I came into this field kind of needing to learn everything, and I was willing to ask questions of where's this come from? What's it based on? Why are we doing that? The annoying questions when you're 5, you ask your uncle, why? And I was doing that. And then when I dug into a lot of the transportation places where we're having these like contentious discussions of a 12-foot lane versus 11, I was like, really? They were like, we're in a 25-mile-an-hour street. You're telling me this is going to cause all these negative outcomes? Show me the evidence, and there isn't any. You start to realize where the shaky foundations are. And it caused me as a young engineer to realize how important design guidance is.
Yeah.
Because once it's in that book, it just lives on, and then it has an impact on generations. And so it's so crucial that the design guidance is accurate, it's science-based. And you can't have a study for everything, but where you're lacking study, that we are honest about the shortcomings so that you can then make adjustments as research comes around. And I think what was really fun for me was having that curiosity. And when I started the Bike Guide Update in 2012, I actually took some time and dug into the history of, what's the history of this document? What are the sources? What's going on? And it brought me back to the 1970s and deep dive into when was the first bike lane installed in the United States? What was happening? What's the origin of some of this? And I just really, it was entertaining, to me as an engineer to learn about this history. I was dealing with the after effects 50 years later, in the 90s, 25, 30 years later, of people coming to meetings, and I'd have these cyclists saying, well, your bike lane's dangerous. I don't want it. I just want to ride in the road. I'm like, where's this coming from? And it was coming back from this 70s philosophies that were emerging at that time. And you said we're 50 years behind, and the irony is we are 50 years behind.
Yeah.
Kind of the world was at this moment of thinking about bike infrastructure. Some countries chose to move forward. We actually were looking to the inspiration of the other places. Davis, California, put in the first bike lane in the United States. And this person was the city traffic engineer that designed it. He was so proud of it. So there was a lot of work happening, actually research-based, of is this something we need to do? And they were finding in this time period that it was a great thing to do, that it made a difference, made things safer. And that knowledge got lost. And it really fascinated me. Well, how did we lose this information? And how can we kind of return to a fact-based conversation about bike safety in the United States?
And it is interesting. I grew up not far from Davis, actually. I grew up on a ranch in Northern California, just hop, skip, and a jump away from Davis. And so I can remember, some early visits and also some recent visits. But we have obviously in the last 5 to 10 years have really been leaning in towards this concept of protection and physical separation when it comes to bike lanes, and not just a paint, on the road. And again, going back to Davis, they were one of the first to, work with and trial and test the concept of a protected bike lane. They also really leaned into creating a lot of networks of separated cycle paths. And so in many cases throughout the city of Davis, and also getting to UC Davis, the campus, you can, ride on a network of off-street pathways similar to Boulder, Colorado, and get to the university, get to meaningful destinations. Oftentimes you do end up on shared streets, especially in the downtown area. But by that time, everything is pretty traffic calmed. And to me, feels an awful lot like the Dutch network, of where you have protection and separation where you need it because the motor vehicle speeds are higher, but then you have shared space, shared streets when the motor vehicle speeds are below what I would call lethal level, where you're getting closer to what the Dutch use is 30 kilometers per hour, essentially about 18 miles per hour, or, somewhere around that 20 mile per hour mark of, real speed that you're experiencing of motor vehicles out on the streets.
Absolutely. And I think it's fascinating that, Sycamore is one of the first protected bike lanes. And then in the subsequent years, it was removed because of the narratives that started forming around bike safety at that time. But also,
well, I buried the lead on that. Yeah, it was put in place and then it was removed.
Yeah, and it was fascinating is looking back, and I'd read John. So when I came to work at Toole, I was like, well, I'm going to be doing bikeway design, and I need to learn how to do it. So it's 2003, and I feel like I'm 50 years old, and I feel like my generation, for what it's worth to say that, and it's not a word I can't say I've used that much in conversation, but I appreciate being older now because now I have this perspective. And I think one thing that comes from that is like we came through a unique moment where we lived through the invention of the internet and the ability of advocates to have access to information, the putting online of information. I can find a design guide, and in 2003, even at that first stage of my career, that was in its infancy. I couldn't find out about this then. It's only in the later time, more recently, that I could do the research to find this. And I think it's fascinating how I think that the internet is a huge reason that we're getting more bike friendly now, because now we're able to share information, but also fact check some things, but dig into things. So when I came to work at Toole, I was like, oh, you're going to be a bikeway designer. I got to learn. Well, what's the thing I did? I kind of used the tools available to me at the time. And the resource I found to learn how to be a bikeway designer was John Forrester's book. I purchased it.
Right.
Because it's like, oh, here's a guy that is an engineer that wrote about bike design. And boy, I'm going to work for Jennifer Toole. I better read that so that I know what I'm doing. and she didn't tell me to do that, but that was me on my own trying to just do my research. And that's what was available then. And it's like, okay, so that's 2003. That book was published in the 70s. That's what all the engineers in the 80s were reading, in the 90s. And into 2000, I'm like, okay, here's 25, 30 years of that philosophy being what's available to people. This guy knew how to, this person more than anything, I think I got to meet him once, but it was kind of late in his life. And I wish I could have had a deeper conversation with him, but this person understood how to work the system.
Yep.
That was his gift. He understood the importance of design guidance. He understood the levers of power. And he had an opinion that I don't want to be hemmed in the side of the road. Cyclist rights are under attack. I want to just ride wherever I want. And he was a bike racer. And when I was actually, before working at Toole, I was a bike racer. The mindset of the bike racing community is very unique. You're riding.
Well, it's very different. It's very different from the average person who just wants to get on the bike and get to a meaningful destination and get home safely. And I say that as a former racer myself. I was an Ironman distance triathlete for the better part of 2 decades. And so, yeah, I mean, I spent, hours upon hours upon hours on a bike on a daily basis, but it was a different type of riding. And so, yeah, it's a different mindset for sure.
Really different. And I think what Mr. Forrester lacked was empathy. And I've seen it with people that continue to this day to challenge the research, because it conflicts with their value system. And his value system is, I don't want to be forced to use these things I don't want to use, so no one can have them. And I'm going to work the system to make sure that is the outcome. And he was really good at that, achieving that goal.
Yeah. And I would say that historically now in hindsight, we can look back and we can say that he probably single-handedly, and his disciples below them, probably single-handedly set us back decades in terms of the fact that he was able to gain a certain amount of influence and power in the narrative. And so there is a reason kind of why we're 5 decades behind the Dutch, in doing this, because that infiltrated that mindset of vehicular cycling, and people should ride as if they're motor vehicles and things of that nature. And I know this language very, very well because I'm a decade older than you. I'll be turning 60 in a couple months here. And I was trained as a vehicular cyclist. I was a league certified instructor. I'm an LCI. I think it's number 2248 is my certification number for teaching it. So I used to even teach the vehicular cycling, mantra, until I really started to understand a little bit better that sense of empathy that is so incredibly necessary to get more people riding, because that's my background, is in public health and health promotion and creating environments which encourage more people to ride, not fewer. And so it's incredibly important to understand there is a big difference between that 1% of the population that is confident and skilled and can contain or control the lane and just thrive in that sort of environment. And I was certainly one of those incredibly skilled and competent riders, and used to be able to duke it out, whether I was living in downtown Chicago and needing to ride through the mean streets there to get out to the country roads, or when I lived in Boulder, being able to make that journey of the bad stuff relatively shorter before I got out onto the quiet country roads. So I think it is important to acknowledge the fact that this one character, he did kind of put us behind quite a bit. But what's really, really encouraging from my aspect, and understanding the history, I think, is really, really important, but appreciating the fact that we've moved past that. The League of American Bicyclists has moved past that as well. Of course, they were the League of American Wheelmen originally. They were part of the original group that were advocating for paved roads even before automobiles were and the automobile associations were doing this. So they have a deep, deep history to that. But they were very, very much entrenched in that whole vehicular cycling mantra for a while. But I think we've all gone past that. So the positive thing that I've seen just in the couple of decades that I've been engaged and involved with this is that we have made a transformation. And I was very encouraged to see the language in the beginning of this design guide talk about what we need to do is build for all ages and all abilities. This is a huge monumental shift, I think, even dating back to the 2012 manual.
It's a game changer. And I think, with all respect to Mr. Forrester, I think when we're racing, those strategies work for us.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that you will also appreciate that a lot of the strategies for crash avoidance and bike handling skills and how to behave are very similar to what children are taught in the Netherlands, and they get their exams done for proficiency of knowing how to handle their bike out on the streets. there's a lot of similarities to that when they do their exams when they're 11 and 12 years old. So I see a lot of parallels. So, yeah, I don't think that it's all one or the other, which apparently he was. It's either black or it's white.
Yeah, it's funny because I look again in the history I found. There was a moment, and they would use editorials in the League of American Cyclists to have back and forth. So one month someone would write an article, the next month there'd be a response. So I went down to the league office and I got all these because it was, a way to, because they're not digitized. You could see the back and forth argument happening over months. But there was proponents. It's like, why is it one or the other? Let's do both. Yeah. There was a group of people that wanted both, the and. He rejected the and. But the thing that I'm really proud of AASHTO about is that, and that we've acknowledged it in the front of the guide, is it was a rewrite. This is a different document because, unfortunately, the design guidance as it evolved in the 70s, it bled into the first edition of the AASHTO guide. 1981 was the first official AASHTO document.
Right.
And then then you're doing iterative updates. And so even the 2012 guide that we worked on at Toole still had a vehicular cycling foundation in it. And I think it's hard the average person that's not steeped in design guidance understand what that means, but the premise was vehicular cycling is the underlying basis of it. And then, yes, you can sometimes do a side path or a bike lane, but it had all these caveats about it. And the new guide flips it on its head. And so instead of that being the baseline, what we're seeing in the picture, it's like, no, in a safe systems environment where it's all ages and abilities, it makes no sense for a family to be biking down this road next to that truck. Because yes, I can be taught lane positioning and I can wear yellow and I can have all the stuff. But if the truck driver makes a mistake, if I hit a pothole, if I'm looking back to scan for traffic as I'm trained, and then I bike into a pothole, I'm under the wheel of that truck and I'm dead. There's no room for error in this system. And that is, I think, a timing thing where safe systems, Vision Zero in the last decade has come into acceptance in the industry. It was not really, we talk about safety, but we weren't embracing it holistically. And now the industry is increasingly really embracing that. And when you follow it to its logical conclusion of where this leads, of creating a system that protects when people make mistakes, that it is available to people with all ages and ability, including people with disabilities, children, then you approach the way you design things differently. And this new guide embraces that. The 2012 guide, we weren't allowed to embrace it then. The industry wasn't ready for it.
And a lot has really changed. I mean, when you think about the fact that the language that you're using or was not allowed to do that really speaks to the fact that a lot really has changed. We're starting to really speak truth to power. I'm good friends with Chuck Marone and the Strong Towns movement and his book Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, very influential in this world. I mentioned Wes Marshall earlier. We're really starting to question the power and the control that the status quo of car dependency has had. I've had Peter Norton on multiple times here on the channel, really diving into the historical context of how motordom really, you took control of the narratives and squashed down the resistance. I mean, we always look to the Netherlands and talk about the Kindermoord movement and how the families, came in the 70s to try to change the course of how things are going. But, Peter mentions that, it reminds us that, hey, every single decade, prior to that, we saw the same sorts of protests, but they just got squashed or, eventually the news cycle moved on and, happy motoring continued.
Right. I think another part of the interesting moment is these last 20 years has been a resurgence of urban areas, the city. There's been an embrace of more density. Now we're seeing parking minimums eliminated. So there's all these other soft, very much related issues that were not in our control, but were affecting outcomes, that all the different parts are coming together now, and it's making biking very viable. I've watched biking through my 25 years I live in DC. I've watched the city transform itself, as one street at a time, and they were painful and slow projects. But I was talking to Gabe Klein at the NACTO their bike guide release party last week at TRB, and we were reflecting on, we can look back at 20 years now of iterative change has now created a network that connects, that all those little battles have added up to a meaningful system that is functioning and usable. And now you see the results, that very high rates of bike use in DC now, a lot more acceptance for pretty big changes to street operations. You don't win every battle, but by and large, the system's coming together, and we're seeing that in every city. I see it in Austin, Seattle, New York, on and on, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Places that you wouldn't think about embracing these things are doing it because it just makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, you just mentioned TRB, so I pulled up their website, and we'll dive into that a little bit. But you also channeled the fact that we have another design guide that is coming up. I think it's being released. I think it's being released this week. They had the party on the 7th last week. I've got Ryan Russo scheduled to come on and talk about their design guide, NACTO's design guide. Talk a little bit about that whole relationship between these design guides. Are they competing, or do they work in concert with each other? How does that all work out?
It's an interesting evolution of that relationship, I think. So the NACTO kind of existed as an organization, but it really came to a force in 2011 in large response to the challenges of getting the METCD to be updated on a regular basis, and to have that METCD reflect best practices. And what we were encountering at updating the METCD was some of this legacy vehicular cycling into the 2000s, with people still of that mindset serving on that committee and really making it difficult to make changes, meaningful changes to the METCD content, which was making it hard for cities to innovate and evolve. And so NACTO was kind of relaunched and empowered by Jeanette Sedek-Kahn to address that issue. And to say, look, we're going to have our own design guidance because we need to innovate as cities if we want to thrive in this new economy. We're being gridlocked with traffic. We need to have alternative ways of getting around, and biking makes a lot of sense. So they published the NACTO guide in 2011. It's interesting because you said, well, then the bike guide came out months later in 2012. So here we are, a decade later. The same thing, where the new AASHTO bike guide is out, the new NACTO, same time. There was no coordination. It's coincidence of back then, that timing, and in today that these kind of went on that cycle. But back the prior edition, we actually had a chapter in the 2012 bike guide that was cut out of the document that was for separated bike lanes and innovative bike infrastructure. And the powers that be at that time that were overseeing the development of that guide were not supportive of really pushing boundaries or making big changes. They still really embraced this vehicular cycling underlay. So NACTO came out and really went the other way. And it was seen as a competition over the last 10 years. Well, NACTO covers all the stuff AASHTO doesn't allow you to do.
Right.
Became kind of this narrative, and it wasn't totally accurate, but NACTO did cover a lot of content that we had to cut out of the 2012 guide, so we lost a decade.
Which, from your perspective, as you're describing it, sounds like that was kind of devastating, because you're working for a firm that you guys are trying to do best in class. You're trying to get safe facilities out on the streets of these communities, and then you're also doing this additional heavy lift of work of helping with these guides, and then to have that sort of stuff cut, which is going to save lives, has got to be rough.
it was hard. It was very tough on the team, and a lot of AASHTO members wanted it in there, but the way that organization is set up is it's a contingency of all this 50 states, and the power players at that time weren't on board with that kind of a change. So it was heartbreaking because we knew by not having that guidance in there how difficult we would continue to have all these challenging conversations with agencies to implement and change. Agencies that in some cases wanted to do something different, but didn't feel they had the support and protection and design guidance to try something different. And they weren't going to be the leading edge change agents that, a lot of the NACTO cities were willing to say, look, we have to innovate. New York City, Portland, DC, we're going to do this and go beyond what the best practices are today in the industry. The NACTO guide became their go-to resource as backup for that because they didn't feel they could look at the AASHTO guide for support and a lot of these new innovative treatments. And that did slow down implementation. And that's why this time it's incredible because we got a new NACTO guide coming out, which is updated, which is awesome. We got the AASHTO bike guide. And unlike last time where they were really covering different ground, but AASHTO was kind of holding back the industry from really embracing rapid change. Now they're in sync.
Nice.
They are very complementary of each other. I mean, if I'm a designer, I want both of those documents on my desk,
right?
To make decisions, and you're going to get a lot of great design guidance from using them both.
Talk a little bit about how that actually works when it comes down to, the quote unquote sausage making of trying to get good facilities out on our streets, and we hear constantly getting feedback from various, cities and municipalities, et cetera. Oh, no, we can't do that. That's not in the guide, or that's not allowed, et cetera. How does that really work with having these now updated guides? How will that help facilitate better facilities actually being able to be built and on the ground? Is it going to be like a magic wand and saying, see, you can do it? Or is it, how does that really work to try to get these things on the ground?
Well, there are kind of two perspectives on it. One, game changer, because when design guides reflect the values of where you want to go, and they're not tying your hands behind your back, they're giving the engineer the freedom to make decisions for better outcomes, then that is empowering.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, each agency still has to be willing to make the decisions. There's no forced mandate to do anything. So, now the shackles are off as far as design guidance won't let me do X, Y, Z.
Right.
The design guidance now is letting you build the Dutch society if you want that.
Yeah.
Safe system streets. You can do that, and it's the permission is there. Now you need the will to follow through and the money. But, I've encountered a lot of engineers. I've never met an engineer that says, I want people to be endangered. Never. But what I do encounter is that people operate in the space that they have, the constraints that are under. So when I work with an engineer that's in an under-resourced community and they don't have time for training and they're just trying to keep their head above water, that's an engineer that frequently is not able to keep up with best practices. It's not their fault. It's just they don't have space in their day and their time to do it. And they may not have the structure of the city or the agency they're working for to actually try new things. So they're going to be risk averse.
Right. Well, and you said something interesting there too, though, is that engineers, especially, engineers that are working in this field have gone through an awful lot of education. And although, as to your point, they may not have had very much actual transportation and traffic associated education at the university level, and that's something that Wes Marshall points out, is very few of the programs are actually very specified and steeped in that, but that's a whole nother topic. But the point is that these are smart, intelligent people who are not out to kill people,
Right.
but we've been tasking them to solve a problem that is not necessarily aligned with what we the people and those of us who want a more walkable, bikeable, less hostile place. Their metrics are different. Their metrics are, well, we've been charged to, maintain automobile flow and volume. They have for decades have been worshiping level of service, LOS. And so I found it very, very interesting and wonderful to see in the early pages of this new guide is that it's like, yeah, now we have a different metric that we need to do. We need to be thinking about level of safety and comfort and really looking at that bicycle level of service. Talk a little bit about that, because I think we just need to get our engineers and designers and planners focused on a new metric and a new goal. It's not moving cars just through. Right. I mean, you'll appreciate this because you're civil and you were dealing with wastewater. It's not about just moving more shit through the pipe. We don't need traffic sewers. We need places that are where people want to be and feel like, all ages and abilities can get to their meaningful destinations and back safely.
We talk a lot about feeling proud about your community. Everyone wants to feel proud of their community. Like, let's feel proud about our streets and what they can do for us, and look at it. It should be a beautiful place. It should be a place you're proud of, and not like the joke where it's the strip mall from the Disney movie. It's slipping
Anywhere USA.
Yeah, right. And it's just sort of this threatening, hostile environment, right? And we can imagine those roads that exist in all of our communities, but like, no one really wants that. But we've allowed ourselves to drift into that in too many places. I actually saw an interesting Blue Sky tweet the other day from South Burlington, Vermont. I grew up in Vermont. And this guy put out a picture of a school crossing, slow down for the kids in the school zone. Well, this is 1950. So they're asking then for slower streets and safety for the kids in school. And then they proceeded over the coming decades to widen the road from 2 lanes to 4 and not do anything to make it safer for kids in the school zone until just a couple of years ago. So 70 years after that sign was put up, they came and did a road diet on that road and made it finally safer for the kids to get to school, because all these years we were shooting for a goal of just getting people to drive everywhere. And even though the public had been asking for something different if you looked close enough. And so now it's awesome in the AASHTO Bike Guide, which is really groundbreaking. I mean, there's a lot of groundbreaking stuff in this bike guide. But one element is we really hit head on that there is a relationship between how a person feels and safety, their comfort and safety. Now, I can't quantify it necessarily, but it's real. Safety in numbers is a real thing that we're finding through research. Those concepts are in the AASHTO Bike Guide. And then they're actually foundational. So like before, it was foundational vehicular cycling and all that stuff. And it filtered in the design guide. It's in all these ways, big and small, that you may not even notice. The concept of comfort and safety are interrelated, and that we need to get to a system of connected networks if we're going to achieve safety in numbers is foundational to the whole document and the way the words are written, the guidance is produced, and it's everywhere. And so it really is why we ended up rewriting. We rewrote a lot of the text from the 2012 guide. It's a different document because of that foundational change of that concept. And I think that's really when you think about like the public meeting you go to, and John LaPlante, one of my favorite people, was a city engineer in Chicago, and he says, you never can win going to a public meeting with a parent and say, well, who's asking you to make the street crossing safe for the kid to go to school, and say, well, I've looked at the data. There's not a safety problem here, ma'am. You're wrong. He's like, it's over. He's like, the meeting is over for you if you say that. And we've really as an engineering profession, because we can measure level of service, we can measure the speed of a car. It's been harder to measure how someone feels.
Right.
But it matters. if we want people to use our infrastructure. And so now, with the level of comfort and level of service, the way it's explained in these documents, there is a way to start to kind of get at that and measure it and analyze and say, is this comfortable? Is this something someone would want to use?
It's funny you mentioned that aspect of and that brings up your cartoon that you have in your presentation that you gave it to at TRB, and you're like, because this is kind of, we're laughing at it, but it is also very tragic that this is kind of the language of the transportation professional. And, and it's very similar to the cartoon that Chuck Marone put together of conversations with a transportation professional, a traffic engineer, and similar sort of theme of, oh yeah, by the way, we're making an improvement, an enhancement to your street. And it's like, well, wait a minute. My kids exist out here in this front yard, and it says, well, you probably won't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
It won't be safe.
This Ian Lockwood is a real inspiration to me. And when I was early in my career, he gave a talk, and he's so visual. These are his cartoons, and he's really got an amazing talent of connecting, which is an absurdity when you see it in this framing, with reality. I'm like, we actually did this. This street is Florida Avenue at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. Across the street is the world-renowned Gallaudet University. And this is what their street looks like. And I should say, looked like. It'll blow your mind if you get in a street view. There's a protected bike lane on that street today. They road dieted it.
Yeah.
The sidewalk is now accessible because they took the poles out and they widened it. And you're seeing, I'd love to get a before and after of this, because you're seeing the change of what our industry's embraced in the last 10 years on this one block, where we've recognized the absurdity of this improvement. And we're now creating a place that is a place you want to live on, a street you want to live on, a street that adds value to a community, a street that's safe. It took a while to get there, but we're there. And protected bike lanes, big part of that. But just livability, like creating a human scale place. And I think the AASHTO Bike Guide is really giving you a lot of tools. I'm really proud of a section we put in there. It's as much about pedestrian safety as bike safety. Can I cross the road? We have a whole section on trying to ensure that the engineer has the tools and information they need to make better decisions about creating safe street crossings. You could just buy the bike guide and be a better pedestrian street designer by reading that section.
And I believe there's an updated or recently updated pedestrian guide too, correct?
It was relatively recently updated,
like
a couple years ago. And again, the process and timeline, AASHTO gets beat up for this, but I think people need to have some empathy for them. So the way their structure is set up is that all state DOTs fund this organization. We all are part of these organizations. It's basically a bunch of volunteers, right? So each state will send their people to a meeting, and then it's the AASHTO meeting. And then they all oversee these different buckets. One of the buckets is updating the Green Book, another's updating the Bike Guide. Well, these people are tasked with having a day job, doing their day job. And then on the side, updating these manuals. And so it's by committee. They meet a couple times a year. Those processes, by their nature, take a long time to work something through. So that the PED guide was updated a couple of years ago, and they're already want to update it again. So the RFP's already out. It's due in a few weeks, actually, for yet a new PED guide by AASHTO, because they're very committed to being with best practices and keeping up and having there's a need to catch up with the safe systems thinking on the pedestrian side to now equal what we've been able to accomplish in the Bike Guide. AASHTO is very, very proud of the Bike Guide. They're calling it a transformative document for the organization because of a lot of the principles that are baked into it that they now want to see baked into their other documents.
Yeah. Well, it is. And that's not necessarily going to sit well with everybody that's a part of AASHTO.
Big organization.
It's a big organization. And really, when we look at this is the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. It leads one to question, especially somebody like myself who originally comes from the public health arena and from, an area of healthcare cost containment and disease prevention and the medical world. Talk a little bit about that relationship of these guides and the association and the amount of seemingly power that it has over what gets built on our streets.
Yeah, I mean, AASHTO is a nonprofit that manages the process, right? So they represent the state DOTs. So really, when you're talking about the power and all this stuff, you're talking about state departments of transportations.
Right.
Not AASHTO.
Yeah, you page through the lists of who's on the body and who are the representation of them. These are senior officials and individuals within the state DOTs. Yeah,
and it's the same as NACTO, right? So they're just an association of all the cities. But the people doing the decision making are the cities, not NACTO. So the power in the U.S. system of transportation is money.
Right.
And in the 1950s highway era, we decided to create a Department of Transportation and fund it to build a highway system. And in 15 years, we built an enormous highway system throughout the United States. And it's an incredible accomplishment, actually, in engineering history to have pulled off what we did. But the funding system, the structures of money and the money flows from the feds to the states through the DOTs, was set up then for that purpose, but then it's only been tweaked ever since.
Well, and a part of our biggest challenge, though, Bill, too, is that we were applying highway design standards to local streets, and we were ending up with street widths of 14 feet and 16 feet. And you're just, mind-boggling because we know that the lane width just encourages, faster driving. And so there was like this, and I think that that's one of the great things that NACTO did kind of apply in some of their earlier design guides, urban design guides, street urban design guides too, is, kind of talking about that and using the term urban design guides is talking about, hey, in these types of settings, we shouldn't be running, we shouldn't treat our urban downtown streets and our residential streets as if they're the same as a highway system.
Right. And I think, again, I feel fortunate to have been an engineer in this timeline because I've watched the change happen.
Yeah. So you literally got to also drink from the fire hose too.
Yeah, I got it all. But if you go again, I've looked at old editions of like what were the Green Book. There was a Red Book and I think a Blue Book.
Why don't you take a moment to pause and talk? We kept referencing the Green Book. I know what you mean. And the manual, this design manual, keeps referencing back to the Green Book and other manuals as well. Talk a little bit about that relationship so the audience can understand. There's the design guide, the bicycle design guide now that's been redone, but it references other manuals like the Green Book.
Right. So again, given the funding, the way it flows from the feds to the states, and the states control the large bulk of transportation funding in the United States, the documents produced for guidance by AASHTO are very important. They drive a lot of what's okay to do in the funding. You can always do other things, but they're really set the floor. And sometimes the ceiling of what's possible, depending on the agency. So the Green Book is really the roadway and highway design manual. So they call it green because the color is green. Then they have the bike guide and the ped guide, and they have a transit guide. So they all work together to create the transit system. They got airport and railroad stuff too. But for purposes of what we're talking about today, there's really the bike guide, ped guide, and the road guide. Road guide's euphemistically called the Green Book, and it's called the Green Book because before the highway year, there was a Blue Book and a Red Book. And the Red Book was the urban streets design manual that AASHTO printed, and the Blue Book was highways. And then they combined them into one and it became
Yeah.
blue and red,
Red and
with
blue
green.
became green.
And it happened in the 50s and 60s, right? So then you don't, this again, you can see, so like you could go back, we could have thrown away the book and gone back to the blue book, the urban, it's amazing. They're like, you have to build sidewalks in city streets because there's people, the guidance changed. And the reason it changes, the values change of this country. And that's what, whenever I do a training, I always include a bit of history because we're not taught this. Like we can be mad at the state DOT or whoever or all that stuff, but I'm like, what everyone doesn't understand is, well, how did this happen? There was a value system of our society that creeped into these things. And we're living with a legacy of decisions made decades ago. And sometimes we're still making decisions in that framework of decisions what people wanted. One example of this is like why I've watched it change. I mean, imagine being a graduate of engineering school in 1955. You go to work, you're an intern, awesome. You're being taught by the best and brightest minds in the industry. And they're like, you need to one-way all the streets in downtown. You need to build highways. You need to make suburbia. They were trained to do all that. And then all the design manuals supported that thinking. These people became the leaders of state and public agencies in the 90s. Well, that's when I was coming into this and fighting with those people. It's like, you can't narrow the lane from 12 to 11. It's dangerous. You can't do this. And well, what are you basing? Well, that's just the way it is. And those are the facts and that's the books. But that's also what these people have spent their entire careers doing. No one wants to get to the end of the career and like, I was wrong.
Right.
No one's going to do that. It's not a nice place to be. And it wasn't that they were wrong. They were doing what they were told, but then they didn't adjust as new information came in. And that's where all this tension was.
Which is a really good point. I mean, and to really put a fine point on it is that for a system that is routinely killing, 40,000 plus people a year in the United States, recently, anyways, that's the mark we're hitting these days, and increasingly more and more a higher percentage of pedestrians, and there's several different factors going on. But to your point of safe systems design, I mean, that's where we have to be like taking a step back and saying, doing a postscript on this or analysis on this and say, we need to debrief and really figure this out because clearly maybe building wide lanes and encouraging speed in these environments is not a good idea. One of the biggest challenges that I've had, one of the biggest criticisms I've had with Vision Zero as it was originally presented here in the United States is that I just didn't get the sense that we would be successful if we weren't able to actually cut our addiction to speed. If we kept thinking that we would be able to just run our motor vehicles through these environments at these types of speeds, we would never actually, physics are physics. We were just not going to be able to get there. You mentioned a little bit, and we talked about earlier, we had the TRB page, and you talked about sharing the history. So you mentioned that you shared this historical context of the bike guide and its origins here at TRB. Take a moment to explain what TRB is and what is the role that this particular annual meeting there in DC has sort of evolved into. It seems like all the cool kids are there every year at about this time of year.
I mean, it's the largest transportation conference in the world, and it pulls people from around the world, which is great because you get different perspectives of what you're doing. We're not doing what we think is best practice. There's always stuff to learn from someone else, right? And so I think that's conference allows some of those conversations to happen. Those are sometimes the first moments someone's learning from someone. Well, here's how we're doing it in Germany or Australia or, Sweden or wherever. And so Vision Zero, safe systems, like this culture change we've been kind of talking about and around for the last hour emanates in part from this event. It happens every January. Tens of thousands of transportation professionals attend to learn from each other and share best practices and more importantly, research, facts. So the facts are we've done some research and narrowing the lane from 12 to 11 to 10 really doesn't make a difference in safety in an urban area, right? You can put context on it. So we had these rules of thumb, and sometimes they were based on real research that were for highways in the United States that were then misapplied research into urban areas. Well, since I would say ICE-T was transformative as a federal policy, it really infused a lot of money into research for the first time. And it pressured change in like being multimodal instead of car focused. We knew we needed to pivot, and then it planted all the seeds. And so from ICE-T in the early 90s all the way up to now, so for the last 30 years.
Of course, Bill, I'm going to make you define what iced tea is, because some people may not know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I'm sipping on my cooling coffee here, but I don't think you mean that kind of iced tea.
So, ICE-T was a federal transportation bill in the United States. I think it was 1990 or 91. I don't have the exact date, but it's some complicated name. They always want an acronym to sound neat. So whatever it meant, coming on ICE-T, like surface transportation, whatever, that became the funding mechanism for the next transportation bill.
Right.
And then the federal transportation bills in the United States are enormously important because they do plant seeds for change. They create the funding to make things safer. So like in the last decade, Safe Routes to School came out of those programs. And really, it's like, okay, this doesn't have to be a right, left, Republican, Democrat thing. Like, don't we want our kids to be safe going to school? I mean, the police guy signed from 1950 was still waiting for safety improvements in Burlington 70 years later. Like,
right.
People were asking for this stuff for a long time. It's a unifying thing that can bring us together. So that was amazing. And I actually think Safe Routes to School is one of these seed programs that actually help lead to better streets for biking, walking, safety. It was an easy thing that people could agree on. People may not agree on the road diet, but people can agree they want kids to be safe getting to school. So in any event, that transportation conference has been ongoing conversations and sharing of research for decades now that have fed into all these manuals, which are getting us to now we're seeing the results. In some ways, all the research that was coming in the 90s, another thing I'm really proud about our guide, it's the most sourced AASHTO document I think they've ever published. Now, I'm making a leap saying that. I haven't checked them all. But we have 600 references in it. And one thing that frustrated me as an engineer, and as a person who's always challenged the system of like, why, asking why. When I looked at old manuals, I couldn't answer why. It just said this. Well, what's the basis for you saying that? Well, it's not sourced. I don't know. It could have been 5 dudes in a room, or it could have been like a real research project, but I don't know because you didn't say. And so we put a lot of effort into sourcing the AASHTO guide. It's the most sourced guide I've ever worked on. And it's largely research stuff that comes from TRB, the Transportation Research Board, and the great work of our colleagues in universities doing the hard work of research, and the state DOTs who actually fund a lot of it. A lot of those are partnerships with state DOTs and universities that people may not be aware of. So it's all the things are starting to work together now in a way that I think is really good for the future for our transportation system.
Well, I'm convinced. I need to put TRB on my list for next year. And again, this is put on by the National Academy of Sciences, Science, Engineering, and Medicine. So, yeah, definitely the place to be. 2 quick questions before we wrap this up. Well, one for sure, and then the second question is: Are there any final things that you would like to mention about the bicycle guide? The first question is: we've mentioned road diets several times. People keep pressuring me, especially from the global audience, of saying, "You guys got to come up with a better term for that."
Yeah.
Have you heard of a better term for a road diet than a road diet?
Yeah.
That's not wonky?
It's funny. Dan Burden and Peter Lagerwey coined that term. And they're 2 people that were great influences on me personally as well. Peter Lagerwey worked for the city of Seattle for many decades, improving biking and walking for the city. Dan Burden was he still is, but this famous traveler, he put on a roadshow of training for better street design. And the two of them were friends, and they kind of invented the word road dad because the city of Seattle kind of pioneered it in many ways in the United States. Of the first projects to take a 4-lane road, add bike lanes, add the center turn lane. And, they wanted a catchphrase, so they called it that. Let's put the road on a diet. It made sense. It's since become a bit of a loaded word and gets some backlash. And actually, the city of Seattle themselves, I think they call them lane reallocations or optimizate. We're optimizing the space to be more efficient. So there's been a shift away from it, which, whatever. I think marketing matters. I think what, again, you've seen in the hour that leadership matters. In some cases, marketing matters. Like selling a vision that becomes acceptable to people, the words you're using can have a big impact, and I think this is something we're learning. Bicycle Boulevard was one that, again, why are we doing all this stuff for bikes? You're going to turn my quiet little street into a bike highway. That sounds terrible. That's another term that, we kind of alluded to it in the AASHTO guide. We said, look, this is still a word used a lot, but they can be called neighborways, greenways. Like there's other words you might want to use.
Yeah, we're trying to make a place that's better for everyone, not just those people on bikes. Again, so the AASHTO 5th edition of the comprehensive bike guide. It's a monster. It's expensive. Who will buy this? Who's other than a knucklehead like myself that was just like, oh, I gotta dive into this and see if it's finally better. It is much, much better. Who's behind this, and how do we actually force all transportation officials and engineers to have to read it and sign off that they understand these premises that are now outlined?
Well, I'll say this. I know when this came out, there was like high fives across the land from state departments of transportation. They've wanted this published for years themselves. They understand the process. It takes longer than it should, but they're all excited about this. So that's exciting. They're excited to do trainings of their local staff. They get discounts to buy these because they fund the organization, right? So this will be available for the DOT engineers at wide scale. City engineers have budgets. Yes, it's like I would never buy a book for $500 if I'm going to Barnes and Noble. Like, it'd feel crazy. But this is an important resource for roadway design. If we're going to spend $1 million designing a street, we can take $500 and buy a book. So I think as a professional who's working for a public agency, this is in your budget to purchase. And I think there should be really no excuse to not have one at your desk. For the advocates, this feels hard, and I acknowledge that. And even AASHTO would acknowledge that. And I think it's a hard place where they've got to protect the copyright. And millions, a lot of money goes into creating these, publishing them, and there's a cost. And, the fact of the matter is the U.S. is a cost-based economy where we like user fees for everything. And we don't, it's just a choice we've made. And so this is they're a little bit, hands are tied to have to charge for this document the way we set up our system.
Well, and I'll jump in and say this, Bill, is that I was only able to purchase this bike, this particular guide, this particular book, due to a very generous contribution by a donor to the nonprofit who wanted me to have this in my hands to be able to dive into it and go through it. And so, folks, I get it. It is ridiculous. I understand that you probably want to do that, but and also, by the way, folks, this is where some of your donations are going to, is so that I can actually, dive into these types of things and have these types of conversations. Bill, what's one last thing that you want to leave the audience with about this amazing accomplishment? And I also, as part of this, I want you to wrap in the fact that one of the things that you said as soon as you posted about this out on social media, I think it was on Blue Sky, is that, okay, time to get started on the next edition.
Well, I think the thing that I'm really excited about is it represents a change in the industry. It represents a change in state DOTs. It represents a change in AASHTO. It represents a change in direction of where the country's at. These are we're still a little overly complicated. You know, you pulled up the Dutch manual and it's brief, and I mean, they use a very small font too, which is a little hard to read sometimes for older people. But I think it's deceptive. That book would be bigger if it's printed at the font for the AASHTO guide. But that said, the future is simpler, is where we got to get. We are a complex system in the United States. When you go to the Netherlands, when you really embrace safe systems, and you spent 50 years iterating your streets to get there, you end up in a simpler street system. We have an incredibly complex and complicated system here that is too complex and complicated, too varied, too much differences. And I think in 50 years from now, we'll look back and say, oh, that was crazy, you know, but like we will be simpler. If we're going to achieve a safe systems future where our streets are more valuable and nice places to be, they'll be simpler. There'll be less variety in them, more consistency, and that's what you see in the Netherlands. But they get there. So we're only just getting started. You know, it's only now that
what's not in this guide that you wished was?
It's the most comprehensive manual out there, I think, in the world at this moment. There's nothing missing. What I wish
is good, which is a good place to be compared to 2012 when you guys felt like there was a huge part of it that was missing. So
yeah, it was really held back. I mean, this guy again broke new ground. We have content that goes beyond the METCD. That's the first time that's ever happened in an AASHTO document. We have experimental devices. You know, emerging best practices are discussed in there. So it's very forward looking. This guide's going to last a while. Yeah. It may not need to be an update for a while. You know, I wish it wasn't as long. I really do wish it was a little more condensed, but it's a factor of how complicated our roads are. Like we still want people to want to
I'll jump in and say this. I mean, there's literally hundreds of pages that are setting the stage to try to educate, you know, the people who are picking up this book that there's a new game in town here, and here's the reason why. Because you go chapters upon chapters upon chapters before you start getting into the nitty gritty of any kind of actual design. We've mentioned the MUTCD several times. The MUTCD just went through a revision. As soon as that thing dropped, people were already screaming, no, because we didn't get a lot of the stuff in there that we wanted to have in there. And so, yeah, it seems like that guide is going right back around and trying to get redone because there's so much discontent that, you know, some of the things didn't get in there.
Well, I think, and I'm a criticizer of it, I was involved with updating that document for 15 years, and it's the last organization that hasn't quite gotten there. And it's not an organization, but it's the next evolution of the METCD has to embrace safe systems. This document, it doesn't do that. It's not a safety document. It's not based in that lens. And I think that's where this bike guide is a pivot into the future of like really embracing safe systems. And you're going to start to see a lot more rapid rollout of other guides that have that underlying philosophy. And I think the METCD might be the last one that kind of falls in that bucket, but eventually it will happen.
Who publishes that?
Federal Highway does.
Okay, so that's an actual federal highway document. It's not part of AASHTO, yeah.
It's not. It's the only document that's mandated in law, in federal law. And that's why there's a lot of anxiety about it, because it does tie some hands. And you can have a creative engineer that's willing to go out there and take a risk and read it and comfort, but also for fear of lawsuits. And I've been involved in expert witness work. Failure to comply with that document or really well document why you didn't.
I mean, because it does say in the MUTCD right up front that, you know, this is the design guide, but you can use your engineering judgment don't use that as an excuse not to do something that's going to save lives and do the right thing. And I think that we can't just kind of, quote unquote, I'm going to push hard on the engineers. We're not going to let you just kind of, say, oh, I'm just following the manual, right. And this is what the manual says I can do. And no, you can exercise engineering judgment and do the right thing of creating a safer systems approach. And yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed that the next version of the MUTCD is in fact embracing a safe systems approach.
Yeah, I'm hopeful, but I think the piece of it is, that's where I'm really excited about the AASHTO guy, because those engineers willing to use flexibility that exists in all these documents, including the MUTCD. Yeah, that flexibility hinges on their comfort of making a decision. So this new bike guide is giving them a lot more explanation. And that's why you're right. There's a lot up front, a lot of content that's really educational in the nature of safety and comfort and all these measures of the why behind some things. It's written in there for that person that needs that support to then become.
And a lot of these folks do need that support. Yeah, fantastic. Again, folks, we've been talking about the AASHTO release of the 5th edition of the Comprehensive Bike Guide. And again, Bill Schultheiss from Toole Design, thank you so very much for joining me here today to talk about this. It's been an absolute joy and pleasure. I'm sorry it's taken so long for us to meet, and I'm sorry it's not in person.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I'm really appreciate what you're doing to educate the profession, and I think it's another example where different strategies in media are effective, and all the names you mentioned today are influences on me because I'm hearing them in your social channels such as yours and their own. It's how we can learn and support each other for a better.
So you've mentioned Blue Sky a couple of times, so I'm assuming you're active out on Blue Sky. Where can anybody else find you? What's the best way to connect with you?
These days, Blue Sky, I'm just kind of getting into it, so it's kind of a restart from the Twitter years. I'm not going to use Twitter anymore, but LinkedIn is the professional account. Our website, those are the places to find me. I hide in all other spheres.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, Bill, again, thank you so very much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast. It's been a joy and pleasure having you on.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity, and I know I'm thankful to be able to share the word that this resource is out there. Use it. It'll help you.
Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, I'd be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on that subscription button down below and ring the notifications bell. And if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. It's easy to do. Just navigate over to activetowns.org, click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all my video content, but you can also make a donation to the nonprofit Advocates for Healthy Communities, or you can even leave a tip right here on YouTube. Right down below. Every little bit helps and is very much appreciated. Again, thank you so much for tuning in today. And until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers. And again, sending a huge thank you out to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, YouTube Super Thanks, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit. Every little bit adds up and it's much appreciated. Thank you all so much.